Hey friends, welcome to our new small group series that we're calling Answering Questions. The goal of the next few weeks of video lessons and discussion times that you're going to have is really to seek to help us feel a little more equipped to do what Scripture calls us to do in 1 Peter chapter 3. Where we're told to, in our hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. So what we're going to be doing in the coming weeks is talking about different questions, struggles, objections that people have to Christianity. And we're really doing that for two reasons. One is because plenty of us who are Christians do have those struggles. Doubt is not necessarily a bad thing. It's a normal part of the Christian life. It's a normal part of the journey of faith to doubt and wonder and wrestle with questions ourselves. So partly, I'm assuming that some of these questions are going to be things that you've found yourself wondering about and that you would like us to just explore. But then, of course, also a big part of why we're doing this is to seek to live out that command, be ready to answer the questions of others, to help people who don't yet follow Jesus to work through some of the struggles that they have with faith. But this week, before we start digging into those specific questions, I want us to first talk about why and how we are supposed to answer questions and what the purpose of kind of thinking about these things even is. And to do that, I just first want to talk about when it comes to people's objections and questions. I think there's two errors that we can fall into. Two errors. One is the idea that we actually don't need to be able to explain or defend or respond to people's questions about Christianity at all. You just kind of preach the simple gospel message, and then God is sovereign and he's going to save who he wants to save, and he's not going to save who he doesn't feel like saving, and we should just, therefore aren't responsible to think and grow in our own understanding or to try to give thoughtful responses. So that's obviously just problematic because of what we just read in 1 Peter. But it's also problematic because it fails to understand and recognize the reality that while God is sovereign and he's at work in the world and he's drawing people to himself, he does that through means, and often through the means of our engagement and conversation and thoughtful responses with them. So it's an error to think that we don't need to answer any questions or explain anything. But it is also an error to think that we have to explain everything, that we have to know everything, or that what people need is some sort of long, detailed arguments about proofs of God's existence and different kind of secondary issues. Rather, the goal in answering questions is to be able to more clearly proclaim the gospel. And for that to make sense, another passage where Paul talks about the idea of defending the faith is in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, where he says, "We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God and take every thought captive to obey Christ." That language there, the way that he uses it, almost pictures arguments and what he calls lofty opinions as being raised against the knowledge of God, almost as these sort of walls that people are erecting that keep them from then coming to know Jesus Christ. And that's actually a helpful image in my mind for what we're really trying to do when we answer people's questions. The issue is not that we're trying to argue somebody into the kingdom. And it's not that we're going to, from A to Z, try to prove and persuade them in such a way that we're responsible for them coming to faith. But what we are trying to do is to help people to engage with the hope of Jesus. And one of the reasons people fail to do that is because they have these walls, or what one pastor I respect a lot calls defeater beliefs, that keep them from ever really engaging with the gospel to begin with. And so it's, Christianity is intolerant, or what about hell, or slavery in the Bible, or views of women, or the different things we're going to be talking about in the coming weeks. What those function as is sort of barriers that keep the person from ever having to wrestle with and engage with Jesus. They just sort of throw them up, and then they feel protected so that they don't have to process for themselves. And I think about that idea of walls because that's a way of saying, okay, so our goal when it comes to answering people's questions is really to just say, how can we how can we deconstruct that wall? How can we move past that wall in a way that helps people get to know Jesus Christ? So that's the goal as we're answering people's questions. And if that's the goal, to kind of break through or move past those walls, then I just want to suggest here for our first discussion 4 principles that we should be applying to any question that we try to answer. So as we're answering those questions, if that's the way we're thinking about it, here's 4 things that I think biblically and practically we always need to keep at the front of our minds as we engage with people's objections and doubts. The first is to keep the gospel the main thing. Given that our goal is ultimately to get people to encounter Jesus, we always need to keep the gospel the main thing. I remember as a teenager, I was listening to this apologetics debate between this very well-respected Christian and this atheist about Christianity and whether God exists and whether Christianity is true. And it was an interesting debate, and the Christian guy sounded very clever and definitely won some points with the audience and had his applause lines and all of that. But I remember coming away from the debate, and something bothered me about it, and it was only later that it clicked for me that in this whole 2-hour debate, the whole hour that the Christian had to talk, he talked a lot about creation and first causes and all of these things, but never once did he talk about Jesus, let alone communicate the gospel. That Jesus lived the life that we couldn't live and died the death we should have died and rose again to invite us into new life in himself. He never once mentioned any of that. And of course, the problem with that is that we as Christians would say is the message that we're ultimately trying to get people engaged with, because that is the hope that ultimately calls them to salvation. Now, that doesn't mean that we should not answer the questions, but it does mean that we always want to be answering those questions in a way that is thinking about, how can I bring the gospel into this? How can I make sure that this person is having this defeat or belief kind of moved past, but in a way that it encourages them to invite with Jesus? One really practical way to do this, I find, is whenever I'm having conversations with people who have some specific question or objection, what I try to do is I try to sandwich the answer to that question in between communications of the gospel. So first, I usually try to say something really simple. A lot of times I'll just say something like, look, I want to dig into that, but before we do that, I want to keep the main thing the main thing. And so understand that centrally as a Christian, what makes me a Christian, what I believe is, and then in a simple way kind of communicate the hope of the gospel to them, and then dig into their question. And as I'm kind of trying to talk with them and listen to them and explore stuff with them, I'm kind of thinking about, how can I then bring this back to being about the gospel? How does the hope of the gospel address this? And in many of the coming weeks, as we talk about specific questions, you're probably going to be noticing me doing at least the second part of that. That the reality is that things like the problem of evil and suffering, things like questions about Christianity in a diverse world and whether we can live beside people with other beliefs than us, really every question that people ask, ultimately the gospel provides an essential part of that answer. And so I'm always trying to start and end with communicating the hope of the work of Jesus Christ, even as I'm answering someone's questions. So that's one principle. A second principle, I think, to working, to moving past those walls is to drive trucks over bridges. To drive trucks over bridges. And so here's the image. A truck is this big, heavy, hard thing. And if you just try to drive it directly into that wall of the defeat or belief, it's almost always just going to crash. Instead, you want to think about how you can build a bridge that you can move the truck across. Here's what that means theologically. One of the things that we as Christians believe, because the Bible teaches it, is this idea of common grace. It's actually one of the most important things to remember if you're going to be talking with people about Jesus and their questions and objections. That Christians don't have a monopoly on the truth, but that God in his grace reveals all kinds of truths in all kinds of ways in creation and shows them to all kinds of people, whether those people are followers of Jesus or not. And that means because we all live in God's world and we're all created in God's image and we all have God showing common grace to us, that there are true things that even the most hardened anti-Christian person, there's lots of true things that person believes. And an essential part of trying to communicate the gospel to people is to look for those common grace connection points and try to figure out how we can build bridges, first of all, to those common grace connection points. Some of that just means talking with people about things that we agree with or our shared values. I think it's really easy to focus on like, well, I believe this and you believe that, and we're kind of antagonistic or something like that. In any time and place, in any culture, there's going to be points at which we agree and points at which we disagree. And so I, as a Christian, should always be looking not just for the disagreements, but for the agreements. So you build that bridge, and then as you're able to, you try to connect the hard truths that you're talking about to the points of contact. So, for example, it is a challenge to many modern people that Christianity is exclusive, that it says that Jesus is the image of the invisible God and that the way to come to know God is through Jesus Christ. But at the same time, people in the modern world really value diversity and being able to engage with diverse beliefs. There's actually ways to connect those, even though they seem directly at odds, to communicate to people that there are things about Christianity and even the exclusivity of Christianity. For example, the fact that we believe that you can't force people to come to know Jesus, that it requires them to be drawn by God and enter into a personal relationship in their own heart, that would say that because of that, that's part of why we should never try to force people to become Christians. And in fact, we should honor and protect the diversity of the world. And that's actually something almost unique about the Christian worldview. So you can connect that common grace touch point to one of the hard, heavy things that the person's wrestling with in a way that helps make sense to them. So drive trucks over bridges. A third principle is to engage with the best argument. To always engage with the best argument that your conversation partner is making. And I always think of this as the meme problem with arguments. It is real common if you're on social media, especially Facebook or Twitter, to see memes or snarky comments get posted by somebody that holds a position about people that hold another position. And what's interesting, I have a pretty diverse group of friends online, and you'll often see memes where if you're within the bubble, if you're on the side of the person sharing the meme, you're like, oh yeah, that's great, that's so right and insightful and what a great argument. But anyone from the outside is like, that's not what I believe. They recognize that it's oversimplifying their beliefs, that it's creating a straw man to attack instead of what the person actually holds, or that it's ignoring really obvious good answers that the person would have to the objection. And we don't want to do that meme thing with people that we are talking with. We shouldn't do that with anyone as Christians because we're called to love them. But in particular, what I will sometimes hear Christians do is first try to insist that the person holds a position that they don't actually hold. And they don't hold it because it's a dumb position. And then the Christian will argue against that dumb position. And then they will feel like they've answered the objection. And that just doesn't work. We need to first of all assume that there are intelligent people who disagree with Christianity, and they do so intelligently. And because of that, we need to develop a practice of always engaging with the best form of the objection, the best form of the argument they could make, rather than kind of clinging to those straw men. How do we do that practically? Well, I think of it as having 3 steps. When I'm sitting with someone trying to explore what they believe, first of all, I always, before I start giving them answers, I try to ask questions to understand what it is exactly that they think, what exactly their objection is. And not just, it's not trap questions or something, just ask questions to make sure you really understand. And then second thing, as I'm doing that, I'm also really listening to their answers. I'm not thinking about how I'm going to respond yet. I'm trying to listen and say, what does this person really think? Why do they think this? How do they as a unique individual engage with this objection? And then after that, again before answering, I try to restate their objection back to them in my own words and ask whether they would agree with it or whether they think that that's unfair or they would want to correct it. And if they have issues with how I'm restating it, we go back in and I don't actually try to give them an answer until I feel like I can state to them what their issue is in a way that they agree with. And that might seem like a lot of work, but the reason that I'm doing that is because I'm making sure that I'm actually answering their question, first of all, and that I'm doing it in a way that is fair to them. So that's 3 practices to move past barriers. And the 4th one is, as we do all of that, we need to do it having the character of Jesus. We need to make sure that we're having the character of Jesus. You can't overlook the fact in 1 Peter 3 that Peter at the very end says, after he says we make a defense, he says we do it with gentleness and respect. And that's even more striking if you pay attention to the context. In the verses leading up to 1 Peter 3:15, what Peter is talking about is the church facing persecution. That's actually really striking about what he says. He's not talking about making a defense in the sense of like you're going to get coffee with somebody, although it obviously applies there. He's talking about you getting dragged before the civil authorities and asked to make a defense of your faith, lest you be thrown in prison. But he says, nonetheless, even in that situation, as you seek to give an answer, you should be doing it with gentleness and with respect for the person who is demanding it of you. Or, if I could boil this down to what my grandma always used to say, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. I have seen a lot of Christians give good answers to questions in ways that would make me never want to be a Christian. They are mean, they are arrogant, they are harsh or mocking to the person that's asking. And the problem with all of that is that all of that is actually in many ways just creating a new wall even as you seek to tear others down. We need to use words, we need to use thoughtful reasons and all of that as we invite people to Christianity, but we are also supposed to use our lives. People should be able to look at our lives and say, that's what it means to be a Christian, that's what it means to follow Jesus. I want that. There's something attractive there to me. And if we're failing to have the character of Jesus, even if we're doing the other stuff, even if we're giving really good, clever answers to people's arguments, we're ultimately going to drive them away from Christianity. And so, as you think about answering the questions that your friends and others have, pray, first of all, for them and for God to give you a Christ-like spirit. And then just ask as you're talking with them, am I being kind in this? Am I being gentle? Am I being humble and communicating to them that I want to learn and that I don't think that I'm smarter to them? And as we do all of that, I don't just mean that we like put on an act of that. I mean that we're exploring our own hearts. It's not uncommon for me to come away from a hard conversation with somebody and to sit and replay it. You might do that too. But part of what I'm trying to do is not just to replay it and think, oh, what could I have said that was smarter sounding or something like that? Although I'm guilty of doing that. But rather to be asking, how did this person come away feeling? Was I honoring to Jesus in the way that I treated them? And if not, I seek to confess that to Jesus. And if it's appropriate, I seek to apologize to the other person for doing that. In many ways, what that's saying is another way of saying that we need to keep the gospel the main thing. Remember, if our goal is to introduce people to the hope of Jesus Christ, then the way that we treat them should be showing them the grace and love of Jesus that we are then communicating to them in our message. So that is some big picture thoughts about how we talk with people who have questions. In the coming weeks, we're then going to be drilling down into some more specific objections and questions. So I look forward to you joining us more next week, and look forward to us growing together in our ability to give a defense for the hope that we have.